Okay. So tonight's topic is Tob Shem Yeshem and Tob, discovering some early American converts in Shearith Israel's role of Perpetual Hashcabot. And we'd like to thank our sponsor, Rabbi Jeff Berger, who has sponsored this week's session in memory of his mother, Betty Berger. As I was saying just before we began the recording, every single month I read a list of names, men and women's names, in two separate Hashcabot that go on for about an hour's long worth of reading, 45 minutes worth of reading, just name after name after name of people who have been entered onto this list, usually because they've given some kind of gift or legacy to the synagogue for that purpose, and it entitles them to have a memorial prayer said on Rosh Chodesh, every single Rosh Chodesh, and on Yom Kippur in perpetuity. And so the list gets bigger and bigger, never smaller. And what began probably 100 or 200 years ago as a small, quick thing now takes an hour long to read. So as you're reading, you come across things that are intriguing. And I've used this list to highlight some people in the past, like Naftali Hart Myers. I don't know if you recall. And the thing that attracted me to him was his titles, Ribi, Naftali, Bar Ribi. And so that was interesting to me. But sometimes I get other people that flash before me that I get intrigued by. And one of them has been this fellow, Jacob Brinley of Kingston, whose Nachala is, I think that says the 18th of Tammuz, or the 13th of Tammuz. And his Hebrew name is Hagibir, that's his title. He was a married man. Yaakov Bar Abraham Avinu. Abraham Avinu is the parental name we insert for a convert. Similarly, on the female side, as we go through, there's an even more confusing entry, and her name is Marat Esther Leah Bat Abraham Abinu. Marat Esther Leah Bat Abraham Abinu. So she's a convert. She's a married woman. Usually we say Hagaveret these days, but we say Marat was the older form they used to use. And I just have her name. I don't know her English name, only Hebrew. Esther Leah Bat Abraham Abinu. Who is Esther Leah Bat Abraham Abinu? The only thing I know about her is that her Nachala is the 15th of Elul. So this is what we're going to talk about tonight. I can only give you some fragmentary things about these people's lives, but I have done some research, and I think I have figured out enough of a story about both of them that I decided to share it with you. So Jacob Brinley. By the way, this is on the top here. You see, this is the way we have this long list. We also have day-to-day lists that we keep in a red book on the Teba, so that if anyone comes to synagogue and requires a Hashcabot, we have the name in front of us. Works, and most of the time, sometimes people come and we don't have the name handy, but it usually works. And if you go to the 13th of Tammuz, this is the entry. M means it's a male. There's a whole list that W would follow underneath. I didn't give you the whole page, but you get the Hebrew year, you get the name, and this means that it's a perpetual list. So who is Yaakov Bar Abraham Abinu? So looking through the records of the synagogue, you do find very scant records of this person. Jacob William Brinley gave some donations to the synagogue in around 1818, 1819, maybe even a little around that time. And that's about all that comes up from him in the actual records of the synagogue. But it turns out that he was a person who actually lived in Kingston. It says Jacob William Brinley of Kingston. So when I first started doing research, I contacted the community of Jamaica because I figured there's a Spanish-Portuguese community there. Maybe he's from there. But turns out I was looking the wrong direction, because Jacob William Brinley is not from Kingston, Jamaica. He's from Kingston, Ontario. He's from Canada. And before he lived in Ontario, he lived in Montreal. And the community of Montreal, which we don't have to go through in any great detail, is a colonial era Portuguese community, like here in the other communities of the colonial America. There's New York and Newport and Savannah and Charleston and Richmond and Philadelphia and Montreal. But Montreal's community, which is thriving to some degree, it's smaller than most of them, but it has a synagogue, it has congregants in the 18th century. Around the beginning of the 19th century, because there's some unfavorable conditions for Jews living there, it's somewhat anti-Semitic. There's governmental prohibitions on some of the things that Jews can do. So that community starts to die out, and people are not moving to Montreal. And there are some old families, the Hart family, the Solomon family, I believe, Solomons, that are there. And at some point, there's no more minyan. So whoever's there starts going to New York for the holidays. And there's a listing of them. And in that list is Jacob William Brindley. So we know that he starts coming to Shearith, Israel for holiday services around 1818, 1819, in that with these Montreal Jews. So we also know by searching newspaper reports from Kingston, where he died, that he was a chemist. And by chemist, I mean he was a apothecary. He was a pharmacist. He sold medicines. And there are a bunch of advertisements that he had taken out. This is just one of them here on the left, for some kind of remedy, salt room. I don't even know what it is, but he's selling it for $1 a bottle. William Binley, it says, Binley, Kingston. He sells it. And Kingston is essentially what becomes Toronto. Or today, the city of Toronto didn't really exist the way it did then, but Kingston was where he was. And there's no real Jewish community at this point in time in Kingston or Toronto. There are a bunch of Jews there, not very many. I don't think they have a synagogue until the 1840s. But that's where he lives. He dies in 1832. And we here say a Hashcabot for him. But there is a little more to his story, and that is his family. Jacob William Binley, or Brindley, you see it both ways, was married to a woman named Elizabeth Catherine. That was her given name. Her maiden name was Nathan. Elizabeth Catherine Nathan Binley. When her husband dies, she gets remarried. She takes on his business, tries to anyway. But she has 4 children who are teenagers at the time, and she ends up marrying a guy named Edward Hooper, who is also a pharmacist in Kingston. But he's not Jewish. She remains married to him for decades. Jacob Brindley died in 1832. She doesn't die until 1892. But she never converts out, and Edward Hooper never converts in. And when she dies, she's buried in the Jewish cemetery in Kingston. And when he dies, he's buried in the Anglican cemetery. So I don't know what it was like in their house. I don't need to know. But she remained a Jew all her life, and Mr. Hooper remained an Anglican all his life. So the question is, how did Jacob William Brindley, a convert, end up marrying this woman, Elizabeth Catherine Nathans. And for that, you have to know that Elizabeth Catherine Nathans was born in 1797, 1796 in Montreal to one of the old Jewish families from Montreal, a man named Moses Nathan and his wife, who's also named Elizabeth Nathan. It's a little bit confusing. Elizabeth Nathan had a child named Elizabeth Catherine Nathan. So Elizabeth Nathan, Moses Nathan is a fairly wealthy person living in Montreal in the 18th century. He dies pretty early on in the 19th century, around 1804, 1805. And he was an auctioneer. He was like had a government contract to auction things, I guess, from bankruptcy or whatnot in Montreal and in Lower Canada. And after his death, his wife, Elizabeth Nathan, takes over that business and becomes the first, and for a long time only, female auctioneer in Canada. And she's a fairly successful, moderately wealthy person. She makes donations to synagogues, including Shearith Israel, as well as the synagogue in Montreal, as well as synagogues in London. Probably she came from London. It's a little bit unclear. But she leaves a will. She writes a will after her husband's death. And in that will, she has 4 children, one of whom is Elizabeth Catherine, who marries Jacob William Brindley. In her will, she says that only her children who marry within the Jewish faith can inherit her. And while there's no direct evidence, I suspect that that is a large reason why Jacob William Brindley becomes a convert to Judaism. There aren't that many Jews living in Montreal in those early decades, in the 1810, 1815, 1820. And he sort of pops on the scene in 1819, 1818, 1819, and he is a pharmacist, and he is renting his store in the same home that Elizabeth Nathan and her 4 children are living in. And then, lo and behold, Jacob William Brindley marries her daughter. And the last thing I can tell you, and I don't have any proof of this, is I think, where does someone go in 1819, 1819 to become a convert to Judaism? There's no Beit Din in Canada. There's no Beit Din in New York. Where are you going to go? So at that time, it seems like in the early decades of the 19th century, if you didn't go abroad to Europe to become Jewish, you could do so in Philadelphia. And in fact, there is a document that is in Shearith Israel archives, as well as a copy in the American Jewish Historical Society that you're looking at here, which is it's a conversion document. It's a document that's written and signed mainly by the Mohel, whose name is Dr. Manuel Phillips. And yes, Manuel Phillips is Jonas Phillips's son. Jonas Phillips, we can talk about another time. We've talked about him many times. He's a pretty famous guy. He had 21 children, so he's one of many children, but he is a medical doctor, and he is also a Mohel. And he is the person who wrote this document, which attests that a certain person, without naming their secular name, so I cannot prove that this is Jacob William Brindley, but a certain man was circumcised in 1819 and underwent Tevilah and became a Jew whose name is Yaakov bar Abraham Abinu. Not only that, this same document has sort of an addendum at the bottom, which attests that Manuel Phillips is a worthy and reliable person. And if he says that this fellow Jacob bar Abraham Abinu is a Jew, then we can rely on him. and that's signed by the Parnas of Shearith Israel, Naphtali Phillips, Parnas Shel Shearith Israel, in 1819, November 1819. And so, again, I can't prove that this is Jacob William Brindley, but I'm pretty sure the timing works out right. The timing works out right also for the will of his mother-in-law, which I think is just a year or two earlier. And so his mother-in-law, I don't know when Jacob William Brindley marries Elizabeth Catherine Nathan, but I'm pretty sure that he becomes Jewish in order to marry her, and I'm pretty sure that that has something to do with the fact that his mother-in-law was very staunchly against intermarriage and protected her family in that way. Nevertheless, as we saw earlier, after his death in 1823, there are very few Jews in Canada at that time. Her daughter marries a Gentile, but somehow never has children with him. They have 4 children who are all from the first husband. Unfortunately, they all die in a short period in the 1850s, and the mother outlives them by a long time. So it's not the nicest story, but I believe I've uncovered as many facts as I can about Jacob William Brindley. And whenever we read his name, we know that he was a pharmacist operating in Montreal and in Kingston, and that he probably was converted in Philadelphia in 1819. Jacob William Brindley. End of story number 1. Now there's another person. Oh, by the way, I don't know if you noticed, Tammuz 13. That's is that tomorrow or the day after tomorrow? That's now. His Nachala is very timely. That was by coincidence. The next person I want to bring up is this woman Esther Leah, Bat Abraham Abinu. And Esther Leah, I have no information about, and I had no information about until a few days ago. Esther Leah, the only thing I know about is her Hebrew name is Esther Leah. She's a convert, and she died on the 15th of Elul. And I specifically went to Shearith Israel's archives to look at older versions of the Perpetual Hashcabot book to see if there would be more information given. None. So I'm trying to figure out, how am I going to figure out who Esther Leah Bat Abraham Abinu is? And I had what I think was a smart idea. There is a pretty famous book by Malcolm Stern called, I think they call it now First American Families. I think it had another name at first, but it's published by the American Jewish Archives in Cincinnati, and they have it's a pretty expensive book to own, but the whole thing is also available online. So you can look through the PDF files of all these family trees for free. And you can search them. Now, searching for someone by the name of Esther is not going to be very successful. But I had an idea. Instead of searching through the index for the names, I did a search through the PDF, which was an OCR, optical search for the word convert. And I had to go through quite a few. I had to go through quite a few converts. But eventually I found a convert whose name was Esther and who died at the end of the summer. And her name was Elizabeth Esther Whitlock, who died August 22nd, 1804 in Richmond, and she was a convert. That was just, going through the word convert in Malcolm Stern's very large book. And when I saw that, I did a search I did a Hebrew date conversion, which you can do online as well pretty easily. And August 22nd, 1804 turns out to be the 15th of Elul. And I knew I had hit the right person. So why doesn't it say her name? That's another question. But it turns out that we are already, for those of you who come to my Random Walk series, are already familiar with Elizabeth Esther Whitlock. not directly, but we have mentioned her before. Because Elizabeth Esther Whitlock was first married to a man named Mordecai, and he passed away, and she was destitute with children. And she was basically saved by a fairly wealthy person in Philadelphia whose name was Jacob I. Cohen. Jacob I. Cohen has Rachmanut on her. Maybe he falls in love with her, decides to marry her. Only one problem is she is a convert, and he is a Kohen. And so he tells the community in Israel, in Israel and Philadelphia, that he's going to marry her. And they say, hold on, wait a second. I don't know if that's kosher. And they convene a bet din. And the bet din brings in someone named another person named Mordecai, who was the topic of our last conversation, Mordecai of Vilna, Lithuanian son of a rabbi, who says no can do, cannot marry a Kohen, cannot marry a convert. And that was a discussion we had in the past. And so the Mikveh Israel congregation gives instructions to Gershom Mendy Seixas, their Chazan at the time, saying you cannot perform this wedding. Nevertheless, as you can see here on your screen, he goes ahead. Jacob I. Cohen goes ahead and marries Esther Whitlock Mordecai. And this is their ketubah. And as you can see, it is very unusual because it says here, Yaakov bar Yehoshua HaKohen Amar la lehada al let's see, it should say almalata. That's the widow. Gioret, the convert, Esther bat Abraham. You will never find a ketubah like this, because this is not permitted in Jewish law, but he did it anyway. And there are people who are signing it. The real question is who wrote it, because as you can see, the witnesses don't sign in Hebrew. They're pretty famous people: Mordechai Sheftal, Israel Jacobs, and Chaim Solomon. And here on the left is the signature of the groom. It's a little bit hard to read, but it actually says Yaakov ben, I think that says Harav Yehoshua, maybe Zal. And then it says this is the place that he's from, Oberdorf or something like that, in Germany. Now, looking at this signature, I don't think the groom wrote this ketubah. Not very neat. It's not particularly well lettered. So somebody wrote this ketubah for them, and that remains a mystery, because whoever did it must have known that this was not really permitted. Anyway, that is not the end of the story, but that is the discovery. Now I know who Esther Leah bat Abraham Abinu is. Her name is Esther Whitlock Mordecai Cohen. She is the wife of Jacob I. Cohen. Is it a rabbinic prohibition for a Kohen to marry a convert? Yes, it is a rabbinic prohibition for a Kohen to marry a convert, but it's pretty basic. It's in the Gemara. The only thing it says in the Torah is that a Kohen cannot marry a zonah, a licentious woman. But the rabbis interpret that to mean not a moral thing, but someone who came from who was not born Jewish, and on other categories as well. But and that has been the halacha since Mishnaic times. Correct. Alexander tells him also divorcee and a chalutza. Well, actually, not a divorcee. Only the Kohen Gadol can't marry a divorcee. I think that's even lesser thing. But yes, there are rules about such things. That's not my point here. My point here, this is just sort of a fascinating thing that we've seen this person. This is a famous case of individuals flaunting the authority of the community in early America. The congregation said, Asur, don't do it. They did it anyway. Not only did they do it anyway, they went on to have a pretty prominent lifestyle, not in Philadelphia. They leave Philadelphia, they get married in Philadelphia, they can't stay there. The community will not permit them to stay there. He moves to Richmond, Virginia, where they become one of the more prominent families in Richmond, Virginia. He had actually, Jacob Cohen, his wife, Esther Mordecai, had been living in Philadelphia, but he had been living in Charleston and then in Richmond. He was a veteran of the American Revolution, and he wasn't just a veteran in name. He fought in certain battles. There is even some thought that he was captured by the British at some point. He also is one of the early Jewish settlers in Richmond, Virginia, and he has business relations with some famous people, including Daniel Boone, of all people. So he's a prominent person, and he's a wealthy person, and he's one of the people who found Beth Shalom, the community of Richmond, Virginia. And here is his portrait, which was done by Peel. So it's pretty, if you can afford to get your likeness painted by one of the most preeminent portrait artists in America, you're doing all right. So here is Jacob I. Cohen. And he married a woman named Elizabeth Whitlock. She dies August 22nd, 1804. We've already seen that. Then he goes on to marry another woman named Rachel Jacobs, who he doesn't want to be alone, and he ends up marrying Rachel Jacobs, and he moves back to Philadelphia after 1804. So he gets married in 1782. He has a nice life with his first wife. He has no children with her, although she has children from her first marriage to a man named Mordecai. And after her death in Richmond, he leaves Richmond and he goes back to Philadelphia, and he becomes the Parnas in Mikveh Israel. While he was married to her, he was persona non grata. After her death, he was welcomed back, and he even becomes the Parnas. And he dies and is buried there in Philadelphia in 1823. So I know you're asking what I'm asking, and I don't have a good answer for. Why is Elizabeth Esther Leah Bat Abraham Abinu Whitlock Mordecai Cohen in our Hashcabot? That's the mystery that I'm not sure I have any good answer for, but I do have at least one suggestion. But I want you to take a look at this family tree a little bit. So he has no children, Jacob I. Cohen, but he has a brother who went to Richmond, but ultimately goes to Baltimore. His children become the founders of the community in Baltimore. He has several children living there. Benjamin Cohen is living there. Mendes Cohen lives in Baltimore. Jacob I. Cohen, who's not related to Jacob I. Cohen, this fellow, another person is living in Baltimore. They become the founders of the Jewish community of Baltimore in the early 19th century. And Etting, some of these names are pretty famous. There's an amazing, if you ever see, you could look up Mendes Cohen, you can see a great portrait. I'm not going to surprise it for you. You'll Google it. You'll want to see it. Mendes Cohen. You're going to see what he looked like. But very prominent. Jacob I. Cohen, when he dies, he has no children. He is a very, very wealthy person, and he gives money to all of his nephews and to synagogues throughout the United States. There aren't that many, including Shearith, Israel, including Richmond, including Charleston, including Baltimore, and of course, Mikveh Israel. And that is where I think things come into play for the Hashcabot, because it turns out that Esther Leah bat Abraham Avinu is not the only member of this family to have a Hashcabot being read for them every single month. In fact, there is a Hashcabot being said for someone named, where is it here? Here is Marat Esther Leah bat Abraham Avinu, 15th of Elul. Here's another person, Marat Pesla bat Yaakov, with no name here. Pesla bat Yaakov. Who is Pesla bat Yaakov? Pesla bat Yaakov is Jacob I. Cohen's mother. She died August 26, 1797. Guess what? That date matches up. Pesla bat Yaakov. Joshua Cohen is Jacob Cohen's father. Look at how he's here too. Hagavir, Ribi, Yehoshua, Bar HaKadosh, Ribi Meir HaKohen. I'm not sure what is intended by these titles, but I would venture to say that they were learned people, which makes his son's marriage to a convert all the more strange. But we also say a Hashcabot for this man's father, and we say a Hashcabot for himself. Here he is on the next page. Where is it? Hayashish hanechbad hagabir. That's given to only someone who's was actually honorable. He was the Parnas of Mikveh Israel. That's why he gets that title. Yaakov bar Yoshua Kohen of Philadelphia. Jacob I. Cohen of Philadelphia. So it turns out that we say a Hashcabot for all of these people every single month. But there must have been some discomfort on the part of the congregation with Esther Leah bat Abraham Avinu. They don't write her as our normal convention would be Esther Leah Eshet Yaakov HaKohen. No, can't do that. Also, she has two husbands, so that's also wouldn't do the father. But they don't put in her English name. They sort of hide the fact of who she was. And there's no notes about this anywhere. I tried to look through the minutes to try to find some remnant of why they would put in the name of somebody without the information. But I think that they were uncomfortable. They took his money, they took his legacy, they say the Hashcabot, but they sort of hide the relationships a little bit because it was not really a kosher marriage. Now, what's really interesting, and I've been searching and searching, and I find this really fascinating. Jacob I. Cohen had a second wife after his first wife, Rachel Jacobs, who does not appear in Shearith Israel's Hashcabot book. And I have to call Mikveh Israel and see if she is there, because that's where she died. But we get him, we get his first wife, we get his mother, we get his father, but not his second wife. Not sure why. And that is the end of my spiel today. So she is buried in Richmond, Virginia. She's not buried here in New York. She's buried in Richmond, Virginia. And she has a readable epitaph that says, "Here lies deposited the remains of Mrs. Hester Cohen, late wife of Jacob I. Cohen, departed this life 22nd August 1804. And we here in New York City, I don't know if they recite anything for her in Richmond, Virginia every Rosh Chodesh, but we do. Esther Leah bat Abraham Avinu. And that's the end of my story. Let's take a look at some of these comments. Who made the ketubah? That's the main question. No one knows. His mother's English name isn't there either. Why? Don't know, Diane. Don't know. I have no idea. But that's what I have for you tonight. So I'm going to stop the recording. I hope you enjoyed. Two random Oh, I actually no, I have a coda. I have a coda. Conversion in the early decades of this country, in the early America, was not so common, but it's more common than you think. There, it did happen. Um, Both unfortunately out of Judaism into Christianity, which is maybe more what one would expect, being a small minority in a large country. Um, but there were Christian converts to Judaism, and they get remnants throughout the eras, in all the congregations. But so in New York, they generally frown upon it, and they try to send people to convert elsewhere. They'll accept converts from other communities. New York has almost no converts being converted in New York until the 1840s. There are some, maybe, but not so in Philadelphia. As I mentioned earlier in the beginning, Philadelphia does have converts. And there's a great description by one of these converts, who we'll talk about another time, who also marries a Kohen. Something was going on in Philadelphia. I don't know. And this is like in 1805 or something like that, a little bit earlier than Jacob Brindley, right around the same period, maybe a little later than Esther Leah, Esther Whitlock. There's a description of how it went. So she had to live with a Jewish family and learn kashrut and learn the rules, learn the halachot of Judaism. Doesn't say for how long, but it seems a significant period of time. And then when the day arrived for her conversion, they built, and maybe this was something that was there all the time, or maybe that was built specially for this occasion, I don't know, along one of the rivers near Philadelphia, a wooden platform with a shack and stairs that went down into the water. So she could undress in privacy with an attendant, go down the stairs, dunk under the water, and could be seen from the sides of the river when she was only under the water by the Adim, and then get back up, walk up the stairs in privacy, and get dressed again. And it's described in great detail. And this is like in 1804, 1805, by this woman. Unfortunately, and I'll save some of it for another time, the woman who's doing the description, even though she's very genuine at the time of her conversion, she later reverts back to Christianity, and it's kind of a sad story all around. But that is a story for another day. So I guess if there's any point to it, is that there were converts to Judaism even in the early period. Not many, but there were some, and some of them we still mention every single month in our Hashcabot here at Shearith Israel. In fact, these two people didn't live in New York, but we still mention them every single month. So that's the end. I'll stop. Did I stop the recording already? I don't remember. Let's see.